I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker. His name is Bill Kops, and he's a professor of what they call at the University of Manitoba, they call it extended education. He teaches courses in adult and continuing education with research interests on topics related to older adult education, higher education administration, and self-directed learning. He has his BA and MBA from the University of Manitoba and his doctorate in adult education from the University of Toronto. And we invited him because he has just completed a study that's called Older Education and Canadian Universities. And this study focused on three broad questions. What is the state of older adult education? What are the key issues affecting older education practice? And what are future directions for older education at Canadian universities? So we're looking forward to Bill's insights into these questions. Welcome, Bill.
Okay, well, we'll get started. I'll get started. There's a few people slipped out for a cup of coffee and other things, but that's fine. They can join in as they return. Well, I'm going to talk a little about older adult education at Canadian universities, current state and future directions. But first of all, I just want to say thanks for inviting me to this important event that's looking at lifelong learning and living in the 21st century. The community, the McGill community of lifelong learning needs to be applauded, and in fact I've got a sticker to put on the wall to say that you're an exemplar in terms of this kind of initiative. And I'm happy to share some of my observations, and really that's what they're going to be, from a study I did last year that looked at what, how, and why in the future, at least in the broadest sense, looked at those questions of adult education at Canadian universities. So I'm not going to give data particulars, but really, again, as I said, some observations on what I discovered, what I found in these long conversations and surveys with a group of Canadian universities that are involved in older adult education. So for the sake of keeping on time, and I'm trying to do this in about 15 minutes, about half the time I've allotted, I'll stick fairly closely to my script, but the idea would be we'd have some time at the end for questions, answers, questions, and discussion. So just a bit of context. The porthole to I'm going to keep my slides going. The porthole to Canadian universities was continuing education units who were members of a group called the Canadian Association of University Continuing Education, because typically programs for, as the term is, non-traditional students such as older adults are offered by or through continuing education, which is the case here at McGill. Other universities that I included were universities that weren't members of this group. KUS is the acronym, but members of a group called the U15 group of Canadian universities, and any other universities that we discovered with an online search that had something in something on their website that talked about programs targeted for older adults or to older adults. There were 50 institutions identified, and I asked them all the basic questions. The basic question, do you offer programs targeted at older adults? 34 responded, and 18 indicated they had programs targeted towards older adults. And it's that group of 18 that I'm commenting on and of course will write about. As someone who spent their career essentially in adult and continuing education, I'm interested in the question, is there a role? And I think in most cases, because I talked to universities that had a role, were playing a role in terms of adult education, a more substantial role for universities to play in lifelong learning, particularly given the changing older adult landscape? For me, the answer is easily made. It's yes, and let me tell you why. And we've heard these reasons in Christine's presentation, and certainly you would know them well. There appears to be a number of reasons for universities to play an active role in older adult education. The sheer numbers. As we all know, older adults comprise an ever-increasing proportion of the population, and that's very true in a country like Canada. And at the same time, the traditional university-age demographic is shrinking, at least comparatively. So if you do the calculation, one would say, well, then universities going forward should have resources and capacity and interest in serving more non-traditional students. Retirement has changed from a passive to a creative life stage. In the past, retirement, old age was often seen as synonymous with the gradual cessation of activities and characterized by illness, disability, a burden on caregivers and society, and a cost to taxpayers. And in contrast to today's society, attested to the fact that you're here today, older adults are characterized as active, living longer, more highly educated, contributing to the community interests, maintaining careers, exploring travel, and seeking opportunities to learn. There's considerable evidence on the cognitive and considerable evidence that cognitive and social activities, including participation in education and learning, benefit health and the well-being of older adults. So continuing education is good for older adults and the communities they live in. Older adults face multiple role changes, particularly as we live longer, including more time, more leisure time, especially for those who retire early, it's even longer. Changes in housing requirements, death of partners, reduced income, new employment opportunities, whether it's paid or volunteer. And has always been the case with respect to adults and adult learning that continuing education can help inform and support life transitions. And I think if there is one that's more important is the fact that universities in Canada have, and elsewhere obviously have incorporated community engagement into their strategic priorities, thus broadening their orientation from ivory towers serving to educate the young to institutions that engage and interact with the wider community, including older adults. So collectively, in my view, these create a momentum for universities to take action to further transform and more specifically participate in the provision of older adult education. But let me stop for a second just to be clear on what I'm talking about when I use the term older adult education. You can come across a number of definitions, but one that's fairly simple and straightforward was put forward by a person named Ratsoy, who wrote an article in 2016 on this subject, and she talked about it in terms of age, life stage, and formal learning, or the kinds of learning. When she talked about it in age, and we see different age points when people are older adults, particularly with respect to older adult education terminology, but typically it's 50 plus, and there's no limit on that until, of course, we're not here any longer, and who knows what happens after that. In terms of life stage, retired, or at least primarily not employed, and comprising of formal learning, so as contrasted with casual or informal learning that we all do on an ongoing basis. And it's typically not for credit or not for credential. Oh, that can happen. That can happen as well. The other thing I think to point out is that older adult education is not new to universities. Universities have been active in Canada, at least, in a real way since the late 1970s, and that seems to be typical across the provinces. And globally, the best known form created to serve learning and educational needs of older adults is the University of the Third Age, a common term that we hear. The first U3As began in France in the late 70s, and in Canada, the first began in this province at the Université de Sherbrooke. And of course, you know when things got rolling here at McGill 28 years ago. And this, about the same time as things were happening in Europe and Quebec, various programs started across the country in English Canada or the rest of Canada. But they develop more typically along the U.S. style or approach, with programs developing alongside established adult and continuing education programs. So this term, the University of the Third Age, is used kind of generically, but it's not used particularly at least in the organizations, the universities that I came across. It is used, but it's not typically what they would talk about. They would talk about their programs. I obviously, in talking to people for a long time about what was happening in older adult education at Canadian universities, I have a lot of data on what's offered, how programs are offered, who teaches, who participates, why they don't participate, and much, much more. But I thought for this morning, rather than do that, I would simply say that older adult education is alive and well at Canadian universities, alive at least in the 18 universities that I talked with. And there are more. I would have missed some, obviously. And because, again, the porthole was continuing education units, I would not have talked much or at all to other units, although recognize them, would talk to other units at universities that offered programs for older adults or education for older adults. So it's alive, at least in the 18 universities that I studied, and I would say generally as well, but to varying degrees. At McGill, I would say it's alive and very well. At some other places I won't particularly talk about, but I'll talk about in general terms, it's alive but struggling. So one of the questions I was interested in is why universities bother? Why do they offer programs for older adults, educational programs for older adults? The top 3 ranked reasons that people gave me are on the slide, and none are surprising. We've talked about them already. Christine talked about them, and I have already identified them as reasons why universities should engage in older adult education. And in addition, almost all the respondents of the 18 indicated older adult education was encouraged at their universities, and all respondents predicted a positive future for older adult education at their universities. So it sounds good so far. It doesn't get bad, but it gets a little less, I'm a little less optimistic as I look at some other issues, and that is support for older adult education. The picture is a little less convincing, in my view, when we look at the support for older adult education. Again, keeping in mind that I'm talking primarily to people who are involved in programs that are typically housed in continuing education units. Now, it's going to sound like I might be bad-mouthing continuing education. Sorry, Judith, because I'm not. As I proceed, I think this is just sort of a, well, it's not sort of, it's a sense I have from the evidence that I collected. So university commitment is, for the most part, the commitment of continuing education deans and directors, as you would expect with this kind of program, which in my view does present a challenge for older adult education at Canadian universities, because continuing education units, as probably many or all of you know, tend to operate on cost recovery budgets. And when budget issues arise, low revenue producing programs, no matter how good they are, tend to be the ones that are looked at with respect to cutting or changing. Now, that doesn't have to happen, but that's sort of the typical approach. So let's look at some of the challenges and opportunities for older adult education at Canadian universities with that in mind. If universities are going to play a more substantial role in older adult education, in my view, this means doing things somewhat differently as we go forward. And there are really 4 things that I'm going to talk a little about. One is building more viable organizational and financial models. Secondly, creating learning and engagement opportunities relevant to a changing older adult demographic. Thirdly, increasing participant diversity. And finally, last but not least, is strengthening institutional commitments. And so these aren't in any particular order. I think they're all important. So if you look at the first one, building viable organizational financial models, adult education has increased in popularity over the last 40 years or so that it's been prominent in many Canadian universities. But at the same time, programs have changed. Most have grown. That's a good thing. Many are reorganized, which could be okay, could be good or bad, depending on the situation, and some have disappeared. In the study, about 60% or 11 of the universities, responding universities, fully managed older adult education within the continuing education unit of the university. But almost half of those, so 5 or 6 of the 11, offered programs in open community educational programs, or offered older adult education as open community programs, so not age specified. It's not a bad thing. The thing that's of interest to me as we look forward is that some of these changes to the open form versus the age specified form is because of CE budget issues. Older adult education programs weren't cutting it financially, so we'll just offer them. We'll offer programs broadly to the community, or maybe they were, but we'll still target. We'll still promote to older adults. Okay, but makes one wonder, or makes me wonder a little bit. The other universities, the other 7, offered older adult education programs in affiliation with community organizations, and 5 of the 7, in my determination, had independent partnerships. So the organization was doing a lot, and the university was doing less or little of the work to make the older adult education program happen. So these organizations, and what I'm terming independent partnerships, had become, or at least some had become, increasingly more responsible for the multiple functions of program design and delivery, making them key or critical to sustaining the university-based older adult education programs at their university. Now, partnerships are great, and I think it's not a bad model. You have it, and it works wonderfully, as I can see. So partnerships aren't a bad thing, but often the changes to the devolution of activities and responsibilities to make the program happen were a result of continuing education budget issues. Which then causes me a bit of concern. And I'm not counting, because I didn't talk to anyone, because the programs weren't there, of older adult education programs that had disappeared, again, for various reasons, but could be continuing education budget issues. The only one I can attest to is the University of Manitoba Continuing Education has been in the older adult education programming, shall I call it, business, and then we've been out of it, and we've been back in, and we've been out of it, and we're currently out of it. We're not out of it, but we're not providing older adult education programs as we have in the past, and it really is because of the situation, the circumstance of budget more than anything. Although I'm very pleased that as a university we are part of the age-friendly university network, and we're the first Canadian university to put up their hand. So that's great. There is promise. So in my view, these kinds of changes are troublesome as we look to the future, because they happen primarily because of pressures of the cost recovery financial budget models in continuing education, suggesting changes were not strategic, but were circumstantial budget driven. So changes is good, or we hope it's always good. But I think we want to make change for reason, not because of a circumstance that confronts us. I think universities need to be strategic and consider alternative funding and organization models for older adult education that move away from these these budget-driven decisions, unfortunately, that continuing education units are faced with because of the nature of their operation within the university. I mean, there are any number of things one could do, but if we just look at things financially, the university could say, yeah, this is important, and we're going to fund it, whether it's housed in continuing education or somewhere else. I think it's a good idea, in my experience, in my view, to have older adult education programs as part of continuing education units. It's the funding issue that we need to reconsider. So this idea of cost centers or service centers is in place in some institutions, but not too many. I mean, the ones that are financially the most stable are older adult education programs such as Simon Fraser, which has a very nice endowment because of actually one of the founding people of the 55-plus program at Simon Fraser gave a generous donation, which was matched by the university. And so that covers a lot of the operating costs of that component of continuing education at Simon Fraser University, and therefore it keeps them financially stable. Whoops. Oh, right. I have no slide for this next comment, so just don't look at this one for a second. I think along with the growing number of older adults, the older adult demographic is changing in terms of health, education needs, technological understanding, and active lifestyle, sort of the typical baby boomer characteristics that we hear about versus those that had come before. So I think universities need to consider how to best engage this changing demographic, and I hear that in terms of the conversation around this symposium. Continuing to do the same kinds of educational programs is going to sustain interest, at least in the short term and maybe even beyond, but I feel failure to adapt to the needs of the changing demographic of older adults. We'll see busy older adults begin to go elsewhere to satisfy their learning and social needs and to fill their discretionary time. And we've heard this already this morning that, for example, more older adults, or as more older adults become adopters of technology, online courses, or that kind of online engagement can be more attractive, specifically to those people who don't live in proximity, or they have difficulty in getting to campuses and other centers where courses may be held. That this kind of learning is something, and I heard a comment this morning, is happening, and of interest. Besides the cadre of courses that are online at most universities, Simon Fraser University, and I mentioned them, I'm going to mention them one more time, have developed through their 55-plus program online courses specifically designed to the older adult audience. I mean, another is to experiment in intergenerational learning. We're going to hear more about that today, and I think that's really exciting stuff. And again, colleagues, I'm not saying they're the only ones, but colleagues at Simon Fraser University have developed courses specifically to make intergenerational learning happen. So they have courses where they invite undergraduate or graduate students to register, and they get full credit for it, but at the same time, it's the 55-plus audience that is invited to join those courses as well. So obviously there's reserved seats for both groups. Increased participant diversity is I think, another important point. When I talk to the people at the 18 universities, to a person, or they would say there's a lack of diversity, participant diversity in older adult education programs offered at Canadian universities, offered at their universities collectively. I say Canadian universities. So in my view, this needs to be addressed. Certainly our universities talk about access for all, and I think older adult education programs need to pay particular attention to this. I think universities, in terms of these kinds of programs, need to get to know their surrounding communities, which they probably do, but in terms of older adult education, they need to reach out to people living in these communities, and very specifically, universities need to become proactive in efforts to recruit older adult participants from underserved communities, including finding topics and learning formats that will interest and engage them. A good example is University of Regina. They have a number of programs. One is called Aboriginal Grandmothers Caring for Grandchildren Network, a very successful program run in the community by the university. And sort of last but not least, and this really is a plug for Christine, and we did have tea and a bicky last year, so it's not because she bought the tea and the bickies that I'm giving her a plug, but really this is I think critical to making things happen in all kinds of positive ways in the future. It seems to me if universities are to embrace this expanding older adult demographic, they need to go beyond the efforts of continuing education units, no matter how good they are, that offer courses on a cost recovery basis and develop a university-wide commitment to engage older adults. The question needs to change from should we, as universities, serve older adults and older adult learners to how do universities best engage older adults and older adult learners. In my opinion, the age-friendly university initiative at Dublin City University that we heard about just a few minutes ago is a great example of a framework to guide action towards this kind of commitment. While older adults are the focus of educational programming at a number of Canadian universities, at least the ones I talked to date only one, I'm going to update that, 2 Canadian universities have joined the Dublin City University Initiative. I think more universities need to take such steps. It doesn't have to be that one, but take such steps to signal the inclusion of older adults in the academic community of the university and to make important institutional commitment to engage older adults. By doing this, I think universities can begin to build learning communities, such as you have here, that expose older adults to the full range of university resources and opportunities, including opportunities to participate in research, work on outreach projects, attend events and lectures, the whole educational component, take part in intergenerational learning, and even live on university campuses, which again at the reception last night I heard is being moved along here. Interestingly, the University of Manitoba a number of years ago acquired a golf course right next door. There's a grand project, no, not for golf, which would have been nice because I am a golfer, but it's a property that is under development with large competitions in terms of design, at least in terms of how the property will develop. And I hear that the kind of mixed housing that will be in that property might see older adults actually living on campus. So the evidence indicates universities should play a substantial role in older adult education, and I feel the time to take action to transform themselves. It's time to take action to transform themselves to more fully embrace lifelong learning in the 21st century. So thanks for listening. I think there's time for some questions and to hear from you. So great.
At one point, you differentiated between formal and informal learning, and I wonder if you could give me a definition. I'm wondering what our program at MCLL would be considered.
Oh, it would be formal.
It would be formal. So
yeah.
that doesn't mean grades necessarily, or
no,
degree course.
It would be the kinds of things if you were, informal learning, it's not a definition, more by way of example. If someone was following was interested in the Vietnam War and was just following the Ken Burns, can't remember her first name, Novak series, that's, and you might then discuss it with your friends. That would be informal learning versus coming to an organized event, either at an educational institution or it could be another kind of non-educational institution as well.
semi-official kind of system. And I think what we have, I haven't heard in anything said so far, because learning still is something which is done to people to a considerable extent, especially in the university. Somebody who knows something gets up and talks about it to the people who don't know it. Whereas a lot of seniors know a lot of stuff. And the thing that we do at MCLL, first of all, we run it. So we got lots of practice doing the running kind of things that we've all been involved in over the years. And then each person who wants to can put on a course, whether he or she knows anything about it, and the people who are there in the room help contribute to it, and there are no exams at the end of it. Having been involved in education all my life, when I got back to Montreal to live, I thought I'd really hit paradise, as the MCLL is such a neat way for seniors to learn. And I haven't heard anybody talk about that yet.
Yeah. I mean, instead of formal, you might think of organized.
You said that only 18 out of 50 requests for responding to your program or questionnaire. Can you tell us anything about the ones who didn't respond? What did they have in common? Did they not have a program, or lazy? What?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I did, quite frankly, I didn't look at what might have characterized them. They just said no, they didn't, and I went on to those who had something in place. And of course, what was in place varied. I mean, if you look at that on a continuum, some had very little, some very much from the university's point of view at arm's length, to others that were fully developed, lots of topics, lots of variety, lots of differentiation in how they offer the program. So there's some that are very robust and others that are more limited.
Bill, thank you for an excellent talk. There's one element that has not been mentioned. It is obvious, but and that is fun. People should be doing these courses and studying and enrolling because it's fun. They meet other people, and that's an obvious point, but still. Yeah.
Oh, and I mean, when I ask people why they participate, yeah, they participate for the sake of learning, but the second ranked reason is for the for the interaction, which I assume is fun interaction.
I have a comment and then a question.
Yeah.
If one examines our budget, they're well balanced, and they're well balanced because there's a very high percentage of volunteerism in the system, so that we can deal with the university by example, as opposed to dealing retroactively when you're told your budget is poor. So the question that I would have is, in the study that you've done, what is the percentage of volunteerism in those universities, or is that known?
Yeah, I wouldn't have drilled. I didn't drill down to that particular level. But 7 or 40% of the universities did work with a partner organization, and in terms of those relationships, some of the partner organizations were advisory to the university, i.e. the continuing education unit, where others, and this group would be an example, are very much involved with a high level of volunteerism. Now, one of the universities, actually Ryerson, talked about that's good, but then you really need to maintain the high level of participation and the quality of participation in the partner organization. And I don't have to tell you, that's no small feat in volunteer organizations to keep the activity level up, so that in fact the good work that gets done by the volunteers continues to get done. And I know in the Ryerson case, they're reaching a critical mass where they're saying, do we want to grow? They would like to grow, but then the managing of the activities, which they do a lot of, meaning the partner organization, then is ever increasing, and how do they manage that as an organization? So lots of volunteerism to little, actually. I think we're beyond time. So thank you very much. I neglected to put on this last slide my email address, but the U of M email addresses are just our name, so it's William, in this case, .Kops @U Manitoba, just the U.ca.